Welcome to the Real News Network in Baltimore. I'm Kim Brown. Oklahoma Attorney General Scott Pruitt was confirmed and sworn in as the 14th administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency on Friday, according to the EPA's press office. The EPA runs on an annual budget of about $8 billion with 15,000 employees. As the key U.S. agency dealing with climate change, this may be the most consequential of all of Donald Trump's cabinet appointments as the world enters a period of uncharted global warming. The U.S. Senate voted 54-46 to advance Scott Pruitt's nomination to head up the EPA on Friday after a 30-hour debate. 2 Democrats and 1 Republican broke ranks, but otherwise the vote was split along party lines, with a Republican majority supporting the nomination. Now, Pruitt has sued the EPA more than a dozen times in his role as former Attorney General of Oklahoma against environmental regulations. Democrats tried to block the vote, stating that Senate members did not have all of the information to make an informed decision due to the nominee blocking access to his communications with the fossil fuel lobby in what could be construed as a conflict of interest. Here's Oregon Senator Jeff Merkley, along with other Democratic senators, including Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, calling for a delay in the Senate's vote on Scott Pruitt's nomination to be the EPA administrator.
For 2 years now, the Attorney General of Oklahoma, Scott Pruitt, has stonewalled attempts to make public the records of over 3,000 email communications with members of the fossil fuel industry. 2 years ago, the Center for Media and Democracy requested those emails through the Oklahoma Open Records Act. And the person who decides whether to release those records, the Attorney General of Oklahoma, Scott Pruitt, our nominee for the EPA. When Democrats on the Environmental and Public Works Committee requested those records from Mr. Pruitt during his confirmation process, his answer was, and I quote, "I would direct you to make a request of the Oklahoma Attorney General's office under the Oklahoma Open Records Act." There's something particularly strange about the nominee who controls the records saying, "Ask me in my official capacity as AG," knowing that he has not responded to those requests year after year.
Also on Friday, the Oklahoma County Court found Scott Pruitt in violation of the state's Open Records Act. As Senator Merkley mentioned, the Center for Media and Democracy filed a lawsuit against Pruitt for improperly withholding public records, and the court ordered that his office to release thousands of emails in a matter of days. And with us to discuss this victory for transparency and open democracy, we're joined by Nick Surgey, who is the Center for Media and Democracy's Director of Research and an investigative reporter. His work has been featured in The Guardian, New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and in the Washington Post and many other places, including the Colbert Report on Comedy Central. Nick was previously staff counsel at Common Cause, where he led the research and legal work on their ALEC and Supreme Court ethics projects. Nick, welcome back to The Real News. It's been a long time since we've had you on.
Oh, thanks, Kim.
So, Nick, basically, congratulations on the legal victory. So is this bittersweet for you in that Scott Pruitt is still going to be confirmed? By the time this interview airs, he will be sworn in as head of the EPA.
Yeah, it is somewhat. Pruitt's set to be sworn in this afternoon. I think, we had this victory in our court case, and we will get to see Scott Pruitt's email communications, pending any appeals that they may try and bring. But today was also a big win for the fossil fuel industry. It's really their guy is going to be heading up the Environmental Protection Agency. I think if you were to have asked the collective oil, coal, and gas industries who they would want to have at the Environmental Protection Agency, somebody who would have their back, they might well have picked Scott Pruitt. He probably would have been on their list. He's been a leading opponent of the Environmental Protection Agency, leading opponent of rules that the EPA has brought in order to try and protect the environment over the last several years. And now he finds himself heading up that agency, and that's very troubling.
So talk about why your organization filed the lawsuit and why it's important that we see the contents of thousands of emails with energy companies and the fossil fuel lobby and Oklahoma Attorney General Scott Pruitt.
Sure. I mean, we've been trying to get records from Scott Pruitt's office for now more than 2 years. We filed our first public records request, which was seeking emails between Scott Pruitt and a couple of his senior staff as his chief of staff, and a list of coal, oil, and gas companies and some organizations that they fund. We have been told that they found thousands, more than 3,000 emails between Pruitt's office and these companies, and they have been dragging their feet, really, to not release them. They released a partial set of 411, but that's a lot less than more than 3,000. In fact, it means that they held back they held back about 85% of the emails that they'd identified, and it seems that they held back some pretty embarrassing emails. And the reason that we know that is because 2.5 years ago, they had released some records to the New York Times, very somewhat different requests that they made, but there's some overlap in what we were asking for. And there are emails that the New York Times got that ended up in a series of stories that won the Pulitzer Prize for the New York Times, that was looking at Scott Pruitt's relationship in particular with Devon Energy, big fracking company based in Oklahoma. And they showed Scott Pruitt willingly putting his name to letters that were drafted by Devon Energy almost completely with just changing a few words and then submitting them to federal agencies on issues that affects Devon's bottom line, putting the Attorney General of Oklahoma's letterhead on those letters, and willingly being a mouthpiece for companies that, as Attorney General, and even more so as head of the Environmental Protection Agency, that he's supposed to be regulating. He should have a distance from those companies. And so we think it's really important that these emails are released, but just too late in order for it to factor in his confirmation process. And that was obviously intentional on the part of the Republicans. They were really pushing his vote to take place this afternoon, because we're talking about just Tuesday. Tuesday next week is when we're going to get those emails. And the Republicans, against the objections of the Democrats, were like, no, we have to take a vote today. We cannot wait. We cannot wait a weekend. We have to immediately do so because, of course, we assume because they're afraid of what these emails are going to show.
Now, Nick, that you have done research and legal work on behalf, not on behalf, but on the American Legislative Exchange Council, otherwise known as ALEC, which is an organization which we know to heavily influence state law and has powerful ties to the fossil fuel billionaires Charles and David Koch, as outlined in the Real News' documentary, The Koch Brothers' War on Climate Science. So based on your research, how deep are the ties between Scott Pruitt and fossil fuel interests?
Well, they're very deep, and we know that because several years ago there was this award-winning investigation by the New York Times, and we know that because he raises a very large amount of money from those industries. We know that because he regularly attends industry conferences. We know that because he has said that he is going to change the policies of the Environmental Protection Agency in order to stop the war on fossil fuels. There hasn't been a war on fossil fuels. There's been sensible regulations that puts a check on pollution, which affects people's lives. But he has consistently been on the side of these industries. And he's attended meetings of groups like ALEC. He's attended ALEC meetings and spoken at, he spoke at one particular breakfast conference at ALEC, he was railing on the overreach of the Environmental Protection Agency. And that breakfast meeting, I think it should come as no surprise, was sponsored by a coal company, Peabody Energy. And so he's consistently been very, very close to industry. He's been close to groups like ALEC. And, it's now very difficult to imagine that he's going to distance himself from his close friends, the companies that have backed his campaigns, that have put him where he now is when he's head of the Environmental Protection Agency.
So what's next after the emails are made public? I mean, if a clear conflict of interest can be made of Scott Pruitt's heading up the EPA, could there be legal repercussions?
Well, a case may be made that he has to recuse himself from certain decisions. I mean, that's possible. It's hard to know until we get these emails. Of course, the problem is that, who's going to force him to recuse himself? That's the problem. But it would be up to the EPA to determine when he should recuse himself and there's a designated agency ethics officer, and there are certain agreements that have been made already about scenarios when Pruitt might have to recuse. But the problem is that we haven't got the full facts. There were questions that were asked throughout his confirmation process by Democrats on the Environment and Public Works Committee that were not answered. There were questions that were asked about his ties to Koch Industries, to groups like ALEC, to big fracking companies like Devon Energy. And Pruitt didn't want to answer those questions. And in fact, the Democrats objected. They said, we cannot take a vote on Scott Pruitt. This was at the committee stage. We can't take a vote as to whether he should move forward for a full vote of the Senate until he's answered these questions. And the Republicans suspended the rules so that they could push him through without him having answered any of these questions. And then the Republicans today pushed through at the objections of Democrats mostly. Susan Collins is one Republican who voted against Pruitt, to push his vote through when there were a lot of calls for, not a significant delay, a slight pause so that these emails could come out and they could adequately vet his record.
So we should mention that there has been an unprecedented show of resistance on the part of EPA scientists, environmental lawyers, and policy experts in both public demonstrations and in calling their senators across the country to block Scott Pruitt's nomination. So if the normally quiet bureaucrats and scientists are risking their jobs to speak out, it seems that we should all be paying attention. So how far could Pruitt go to undo environmental protection?
Well, he could do a lot. There's some executive orders that have been rumored to be coming from the Trump administration, but Pruitt is going to be setting the direction of the organization, of the agency, and it's possible. It's not just repeal of regulations. He could slow walk them. He could have a significant influence over enforcement. There are enforcement officers of the EPA that are distributed all around the country. And what direction are they going to get from the agency about enforcement? And if they're not going in and checking on these crimes, either reports from whistleblowers or from individuals, or their regular routine investigations, if that's not taking place, then there will not be prosecutions brought. And if that's the case, then industry will have an excuse to not abide by the regulations. So there's possibility of regulations that will get repealed by Congress. There are executive orders that could be issued by the president, and there could be a slow walking of enforcement and direction that is set by Pruitt as head of the agency that could really stall all of the advances that have been taking place over decades. This used to be bipartisan. The EPA was set up by Nixon. It was set up under Republican. It was renewed under a Republican Congress, and this didn't used to be a purely partisan issue where Democrats were in favor of environmental protections, Republicans were opposed to them, and we really have to return to that. If we're going to tackle these big problems that we really have to face now. There's been too many years of inaction on big problems like climate change. I don't think that we're going to see a solution when we have somebody like Scott Pruitt, who's a climate change denier and a consistent thorn against the EPA running that agency.
Indeed. We've been speaking with Nick Surgey. He is from the Center for Media and Democracy. He's the Director of Research, also an investigative reporter. The Center for Media and Democracy scored a court victory in Oklahoma, getting a judge to agree to have Scott Pruitt's thousands of his emails while he served as Attorney General of that state to be disclosed. However, that won't happen until next week. And on Friday, today, Scott Pruitt was confirmed by the Senate to be the head administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. So, Nick, congratulations. I'm sorry this is a bittersweet victory for you, but we definitely appreciate the work that you and your center do. So, best of luck and good luck.
Thanks, Kim. It's good to be on.
Thanks, and thank you guys for watching the Real News Network.